just a floor nurse playing doctor. That was what Dr. Gerald Ashford called her, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for those who forgot their station. Elena Martinez didn't flinch. She'd heard worse in field hospitals where the walls shook and people died waiting for someone to care enough to break protocol. But that was another life. That was before Houston. That was before she learned how to be invisible. She arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 6:47 in the morning, 14 minutes before her shift started, the way she had every morning for 3 years. The parking lot smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete from last night's rain. Her badge hung from a lanyard she'd bought at Target, unremarkable navy blue, the kind that blended into 100 others. She didn't wear the field jacket anymore, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, a small piece of her unit before half of them stopped coming home. That jacket stayed in her locker, hidden behind her scrubs and a yoga mat she'd bought but never used. The ER doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in that particular frequency that made your teeth ache if you listened too long, which Elena had learned not to do. She'd learned not to listen to a lot of things anymore. The nurse's station was quiet. Maria, the charge nurse, was reviewing charts. 2 residents stood by the coffee maker, their voices low enough that she couldn't hear the words, which was fine. They wouldn't have included her anyway. Elena moved to her assigned station with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced invisibility until it became muscle memory. Her cracked coffee mug sat where she'd left it yesterday, world's okayest nurse, the lettering fading from 100 dishwasher cycles. Next to it, the dying succulent in a ceramic pot that had been white once. She watered it carefully, the way she did every morning, even though it got worse instead of better. Some things you kept alive out of principle rather than hope. Dr. Ashford swept through the unit at 7:31, his white coat moving like a sail, 3 residents trailing in his wake like fish following a predator. He didn't walk through the ER, he moved through it with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. His voice preceded him, "I don't care what the radiology department thinks they saw. We're not ordering another CT on a patient presenting with non-specific symptoms." One of the residents started to speak. Ashford cut him off with a gesture, not even a word, just a thin-fingered wave of dismissal. The resident went silent. That was the hierarchy at Oak Creek Memorial, silent obedience or professional erasure. Elena had learned that too. She didn't watch him. She'd gotten good at not watching people who had power. Instead, she rechecked the 4 lines on her 3 patients, moved through the motions of a day that would be identical to yesterday and the day before. 4-bed rotation. Blood draws. Vitals every 2 hours. Listen when doctors spoke. Never offer observations. Never suggest. Never remember that she'd once coordinated triage for 60 wounded in a tent hospital in Sanjin where the generators ran on diesel and hope, where a 19-year-old Marine with shrapnel through his abdomen asked her if he'd made it home, and she'd lied and said yes, he'd made it. The next voice Elena heard changed the air in the room. It wasn't loud. It was just different. Deliberate. Military bearing even in how he carried himself through the sliding doors. Commander Thomas Hartley, Coast Guard, early 50s, jaw set in the particular way of men who'd given orders and watched people follow them. And he was carrying a child. Elena froze mid-step. Not visibly. She'd trained too long to let anything show. But the coffee mug nearly slipped from her hand. The boy was 7, maybe 8, small enough that Hartley carried him without strain but old enough that the gesture looked protective rather than practical. Dark hair. Eyes that moved around the room but didn't focus. And the absolute stillness of his mouth, that flat, closed-off quietness that came from a child who'd learned not to make sounds. Elena's fingers touched her lower back without her deciding to do it, found the old scar tissue there, the place where a piece of the blast had embedded and left a permanent knot of nerve damage that woke her sometimes at 3 in the morning. She forced her hand down. Forced her breathing to stay level. This was not her patient. This was not her family. This was not something she was allowed to remember. Maria was already moving toward them. Commander Hartley? Welcome to Oak Creek Memorial. I'm Maria Chen, Charge nurse. Let's get your son into an exam room. His name is Jacob, Hartley said. He hasn't spoken since an accident 6 months ago. For the last 3 weeks, he's been having episodes, seizures, the pediatrician thinks. Very sudden. Very violent. I've taken him to 4 different specialists. Nobody can find anything wrong with his brain scans. Nobody can tell me what's happening. Elena turned back to her full line, but her hands weren't steady anymore. Not visibly. But she could feel it, that tremor that came from recognition. The child's presentation didn't match idiopathic epilepsy. His eye movement patterns weren't typical for a purely neurological seizure. The way he held his body suggested something else entirely. Something she'd seen before. Something she'd promised herself she'd left behind in the dust and blood of Afghanistan. Dr. Ashford appeared as if summoned by the presence of authority. That was how he moved through the hospital, drawn to power like metal to a magnet. His smile was different when he looked at Hartley, warmer somehow, the smile of a man talking to someone whose opinion mattered. "Commander, I'm Dr. Gerald Ashford, Chief of Neurology. We'll get to the bottom of this. State-of-the-art facility, best diagnostics available." He glanced at Jacob with the kind of clinical detachment that made sick children feel like problems rather than people. "Have you considered the possibility that this is purely psychological? Trauma-induced mutism followed by conversion disorder manifestations." Elena moved to room 4 to check on her other patient, an elderly man recovering from hip surgery, but she was close enough to hear Hartley's response. "I know my son," he said. "Something changed 6 months ago. I want to know what." Ashford gestured to his residents, who immediately began setting up monitors. "We'll run the standard workup. EEG, blood panels, imaging. But in my experience, when scans are clean and presentation is inconsistent, we're usually looking at a behavioral component." Elena finished her assessment of the hip surgery patient in 80 seconds, performed with the kind of automatic precision that required no conscious thought. Vital stable. Incision healing. Pain management adequate. She'd just turned toward the door when she heard Hartley's voice again, quieter this time, asking Maria something. Maria was pointing toward the nurse's station. Pointing in Elena's direction. Elena didn't move. She stood at the threshold between rooms, perfectly still, the way she'd learned to stand when shelling started and you couldn't move until the sound pattern told you whether it was incoming or outgoing. The sound pattern mattered. The pattern told you whether you had 90 seconds or less. Hartley's eyes found her across the ER. Recognition flickered there, just for a moment. The kind of recognition that came from seeing something familiar, the way she moved, maybe, or the set of her shoulders. Elena had worked that recognition out of herself years ago, but in a Coast Guard commander trained to read people quickly, old patterns died hard. She made her choice in the time it took to breathe. She turned away. She went into the supply room. She didn't watch them wheel Jacob into the imaging suite. She didn't offer observations. She made herself small and quiet and invisible, the way she'd perfected it. But her lower back ached, and her hands remembered things her mind had spent 3 years trying to forget, and somewhere in the pediatric imaging center, a child who hadn't spoken in 6 months was being positioned in a machine that would take pictures of his brain while it produced seizures nobody understood. Maria found her restocking for lines in the supply room 10 minutes later. "Elena, can you help me with vitals in room 7? Dr. Ashford is about to start the workup on the 7-year-old, and I need someone monitoring the patient's oxygen and heart rate during the procedure." Elena's hands didn't hesitate. They moved automatically, taking the equipment Maria was holding, moving toward room 7. But as she walked, she heard voices from the imaging suite down the hallway. Ashford's voice, clear and instructive, describing the procedure to his residents. And underneath it, the quiet, desperate breathing of a child who couldn't ask anyone to help. The break room fell silent the moment Elena pulled back the plastic chair. She'd timed her lunch to 12:02, that narrow window when most of the floor staff had already cycled through, when she could eat alone with a book and the hum of the refrigerator for company. She opened her container, turkey sandwich, apple slices, a container of yogurt that tasted like hospital air, and sat down at the corner table under the fluorescent grid. 3 nurses from the cardiac wing sat across the room, their voices carrying the kind of easy laughter that belongs to people who don't carry weight. They glanced at her, then glanced at each other. One of them, Patricia, who'd nodded at Elena in the hallway for 18 months without ever learning her first name, stood up. The other 2 followed. Their chairs scraped backward in unison, a small orchestra of rejection. They left their coffee cups half full, steam still rising, and walked out without a word. The door swung shut with a pneumatic hiss. Elena sat in the silence they left behind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in a jar. She looked down at her sandwich. She'd made it this morning at 5:48 a.m. in her apartment kitchen, hands moving through the familiar ritual while rain hammered the window overlooking the parking lot. Every surface in her life had been organized for invisibility: a studio apartment with no photos on the walls, a car paid in cash for years ago, a routine so predictable that no one ever questioned it. She was exactly what she'd spent 3 years building herself to be. Forgettable. The sandwich tasted like paper. By 1:15 p.m., when Elena returned to the nurse's station, a printout was taped to the public bulletin board where the hospital posted shift schedules, infection control reminders, and birthday announcements. This one was different. It was a formal disciplinary notice on hospital letterhead, her name centered at the top in capital letters like a citation. Martinez, overstepping scope of practice and undermining physician authority, formal reprimand. Below it, Dr. Ashford's signature curved across the page in dark ink. The document outlined her transgression with surgical precision. Nurse Martinez made unauthorized diagnostic suggestions to attending physician in the presence of patient and family. Such behavior undermines the chain of command and exceeds the scope of nursing practice. Continued violations will result in further disciplinary action up to and including termination. She read it once. Committed every word to memory. Then unpinned it and folded it once, lengthwise. The paper creased with a sharp snap. "That's a nice souvenir," someone said. Elena didn't turn. It was one of the residents, Chen, she thought, or maybe Davis. The kind of junior doctor who hadn't yet learned that cruelty required an audience. First formal write-up. Wait until you get a few more. They line them up like degrees. Elena kept walking. An hour later, Dr. Ashford found her restocking a crash cart in the supply room. The space was narrow, lined with plastic bins and boxes of fur tubing, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and something stale underneath it. He didn't ask permission to enter. He never did. He simply appeared in the doorway like a man who'd never learned that rooms belonged to other people. "I want to be clear about something," he said. His voice carried the tone of a surgeon who was used to being heard. "What you did on rounds today was completely unacceptable." Elena continued her work. She was restocking 14-gauge angiocath needles into their slots, each one clicking into place with a small plastic sound. She'd done this motion 10,000 times. Her hands knew the pattern better than her mind did. "Are you listening to me?" "Yes, doctor." "Good. Because I'm only going to say this once." He moved closer. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and artificial that probably cost more than she made in a week. "You questioned my clinical judgment in front of a high-ranking military officer and his family. You implied that you had expertise you clearly don't possess. And you made me look incompetent." Elena turned to face him. The angiocath needle was still in her hand, small and silver, barely visible in her palm. She set it down carefully on the metal surface beside her. "Commander Hartley," she said, her voice exactly level, "is on the Joint Chiefs of Staff Liaison Committee. He oversees the medical support protocols for every combat deployment in the Atlantic Fleet." Dr. Ashford's jaw tightened. "I'm aware of who he is." "Then you're aware," Elena continued, "that he knows the difference between symptoms and diagnosis. And he knows what traumatic mutism looks like because he's seen it before." She met his eyes. One steady breath. Then she felt the heat rise behind her own eyes, not from fear, not from shame, but from something underneath both of those things. A single tear formed at the corner of her eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Without apology. I know what silence born from trauma looks like because I've held the hand of someone while they screamed without making a sound. The words hung between them like a challenge. Dr. Ashford's face had gone pale. He stared at her for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Elena saw the calculation happen behind his eyes. He was recalibrating. Reassessing. And then something else moved across his features, a hardening, like concrete setting. "Step outside," he said. "Now." The hallway was empty except for the distant sound of a code being called over the intercom. They stood on the linoleum between the patient rooms, and Dr. Ashford positioned himself so that his body blocked the view from the nurse's station. It was a subtle move, the kind of strategic positioning that belonged to someone used to managing optics. "You're barred from the Hartley case," he said, voice low and controlled. "Completely. You will not enter his room. You will not review his chart. You will not speak to his family or communicate with any of the staff involved in his care. If I find out you violated this, you'll be looking for work somewhere that doesn't require a medical license. Do you understand me?" Elena nodded once. "I need verbal confirmation, Nurse Martinez." "I understand." He walked away without another word, his shoes making precise clicking sounds on the tile as he returned to the patient floors. Elena stood alone in the hallway, her hands hanging at her sides. She could feel her heart still beating, still elevated, her body still processing the adrenaline. But her face was calm. Her breathing was controlled. Her composure had held. It always held. It had held through worse than this. It had held when the tent was burning and the alarms were screaming and there were hands she couldn't save. It would hold through this, too. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the next 48 hours, Elena watched from a distance as Dr. Ashford ran tests on Jacob Hartley like he was trying to solve an unsolvable equation. A CT scan of the brain. An EEG with 17 leads attached to the boy's head, recording the silent electrical storms his neurons were throwing. A lumbar puncture on the afternoon of day 2, the needle sliding into the space around the spinal cord to draw cerebrospinal fluid that came back normal, clean, revealing nothing. Each test came back inconclusive. Each one seemed to make Jacob more withdrawn, his small frame tensing whenever a staff member approached with new equipment, new needles, new invasions of his terrified body. Elena reviewed the charts when she thought no one was looking. She'd learned, over years of practice, how to move through hospitals like a ghost, present but unnoticed, visible but unremarkable. The boy's vital signs were escalating. His heart rate during the tests climbed to 142 beats per minute, tachycardic, racing. His blood pressure spiked. And the seizures, when they came, always followed the same pattern. A sudden sound would trigger him, something sharp and unexpected, and his body would convulse. By day 3, she'd figured it out. The seizures weren't epileptic. They were anxiety-induced, a manifestation of trauma that lived in his nervous system like shrapnel in muscle. His brain was misfiring not from electrical dysfunction but from fear. He was being re-traumatized every time Dr. Ashford ordered another scan, every time another machine beeped or another doctor touched him or another door slammed in the hallway. Each test was making him worse, not better. She wrote a note in the margin of the chart in handwriting small enough that only someone looking for it would see it: anxiety-induced non-epileptic seizures. Consider trauma-informed approach. Auditory triggers precede episodes. An hour later, Dr. Ashford found her at the nurse's station. He was holding the chart. He'd already found the note. He tore it from the page, the sound of ripping paper sharp as a gunshot in the quiet afternoon, and let the pieces fall to the floor like snow. "If I see you near this case again," he said, "you're done. Not transferred to another floor. Not suspended. Done. Understood?" She understood. By evening, he'd reassigned the one nurse who'd been sympathetic, Sarah, who'd helped Elena with the morning assessments, to the pediatric surgery wing. She was gone before the shift change. By nightfall, Elena stood alone in the parking garage, her keycard useless now for any of the restricted areas where Jacob Hartley slept. She gripped her steering wheel, hand steady but present, aware of every small tremor in her own body. In her locker upstairs was the jacket. Inside the jacket, sewn into the lining where no one could see it unless they were looking for it, was a faded patch from Sanjin. 12 faces in a photograph, frozen in time. 7 of them were gone. She hadn't looked at that patch in 3 years. She didn't look at it now. She simply started the engine, listened to it turn over and catch, and drove home through rain that fell like a judgment on the city. The rain had stopped by morning. Elena sat in her apartment, a studio on Westheimer, $680 a month, bare except for a coffee maker and a bed frame from a thrift store, and stared at her phone. No messages. No calls. Nothing from Oak Creek Memorial. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the email that arrived at 6:08 a.m., staff schedule adjustment effective immediately. Nurse Martinez assigned to post-op recovery, level 5. Effective 7 a.m. shift start. Level 5. Post-op. 2 floors away from radiology. She knew what that was. Ashford's handwriting all over it. Not a suspension. Not yet. Just a reassignment. Strategic. Methodical. The kind of move a man makes when he's systematically removing a problem from a chessboard. It was competent work, actually, hard to challenge, easy to justify. Recovery needed staffing. She was being deployed. No violation of protocol. No ammunition for her to fire back. She showered, dressed in scrubs that were just beginning to fray at the collar, and pulled her hair into a knot so tight it felt like discipline. The faded unit patch sat in her jacket pocket, tucked inside the lining where it had lived for 7 years. She didn't touch it. Not today. Not yet. The drive to the hospital took 15 minutes. Traffic on Belfort was light, the kind of early morning flow where every car moved in the same direction, no resistance, no chaos. She parked in the employee lot, 3rd row, same spot she'd claimed on day 1, and sat for 30 seconds with her hands on the steering wheel. The leather was warm from the sun pushing through the windshield. She could hear the tick of the engine cooling, a sound like a countdown. By 7:15 a.m., she was stocking post-op recovery. Gauze in labeled bins. Saline drip bags arranged by date. Trauma shears organized by size. Physical work that required nothing but precision and the ability to move without thinking. She'd been doing this for 3 years. Before that, she'd done it in a field hospital in Logar Province, Afghanistan, with the sound of mortars rattling the tent walls and her hand steady as glacier water. This was the same work. Just quieter. Around 9 a.m., her colleague Marcus came by with a chart. He didn't meet her eyes. Routine MRI, 3 years old, possible lesions. He said it the way people speak in elevators, present but not present, his words meant to be heard and forgotten immediately. 10:30 in Radiology Suite 4. Ashford supervising the imaging personally. Elena didn't look up from the bandage roll she was organizing. Thank you for the information. Marcus left. That was when she understood the full architecture of what Ashford had done. The MI wasn't a diagnostic procedure. It was a test. If the boy seized during the scan, and given his presentation, given the trauma sitting in his nervous system like unexploded ordnance, it would happen in a confined space, surrounded by magnetic equipment that could interfere with emergency interventions, with Elena nowhere in the building to see it. It was elegant, actually. Cruel and elegant. She looked at the clock. 9:02 a.m. The rule was clear. Post-op recovery. Level 5. Stay in your assigned space. Don't interfere. Ashford had made the parameters explicit yesterday, overstepping. Undermining. Dangerous unsupervised medical procedures. The words were still scorched into her memory. She finished organizing the bandages. Arrange the 4 poles in descending height. Check the monitor leads for phrase. Everything in its place. Everything according to protocol. Then she walked out of post-op recovery, moved down the corridor toward the elevator bank, and pressed the button for level 2. The radiology suite occupied the east wing of the hospital, a maze of corridors that smelled like ozone and the sharp chemical scent of contrast dye. Elena had been down here exactly twice in 3 years, once for a mandatory hospital tour on her first day, once to drop off a chart in 2022. She wasn't supposed to be here. The thought didn't slow her down. Radiology Suite 4 was at the end of a hallway painted the color of institutional hope, beige with a faint undertone of seafoam. She could see the MRI machine through the observation window, a white tunnel the size of a small car, surrounded by banks of monitors and the kind of equipment that existed in a world of physics that Elena understood only theoretically. The boy was on the scanning table, a small figure in a hospital gown, his face turned to the side. Through the glass, she could see his chest rise and fall with the mechanical rhythm of sedation. Good. Sedated for the scan. Safer. Less panic. Ashford stood at the control console, his back to the window. 2 residents flanked him. The MRI tech, a woman Elena didn't recognize, was running through pre-scan protocols, speaking in the flat professional voice of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Elena positioned herself in the corner of the observation room, behind the door frame, visible only if someone turned and looked directly at her. From there, she could see everything, the monitors, the boy's vitals, the control interface. The time on the wall clock read 10:23 a.m. The tech's voice came through the intercom, "We're starting the first sequence. Patient vitals stable. O2 sat 98%. Heart rate 88, regular rhythm." The machine hummed to life, a low bass note that vibrated through the floor and up through Elena's bones. The scanning sequence began, each pulse of magnetic force creating the characteristic rhythm that MRI machines produced, thump-thump pause, a mechanical heartbeat that would image the architecture of a child's brain. Elena watched the monitors. The boy's chest rose and fell. His oxygen saturation remained steady. His heart rate was calm. The sedation was holding. Around her, everyone in the room moved with the casual confidence of people who'd done this procedure hundreds of times. Ashford was reviewing something on a tablet, his focus distant. One of the residents was checking a phone. The tech was watching the real-time images flowing across her screen. 10:31 a.m. 5 minutes into the scan. That was when Elena saw it, not a change in the monitors yet, but a shift in the boy's body. His left hand twitched. Just once. Barely visible. She watched his face. The muscles around his eyes were tightening. His jaw was clenching. The sedation should have prevented this. Should have locked everything in place. But his nervous system was waking up. Something was pulling him toward consciousness against the drugs. Thump-thump pause. The MRI continued its mechanical rhythm. She counted his respirations. 16 per minute. Then 18. The oxygen saturation held at 98, but she knew what she was looking at. She'd seen this before. In Sanjin, she'd watched soldiers' bodies betray them in moments of extreme stress, the nervous system overriding everything, including chemistry. The boy was still sedated, still technically unconscious, but his body was beginning a seizure. A psychogenic seizure, born from the trauma that had stolen his voice 6 months ago. His brain was screaming itself awake. 10:34 a.m. 7 minutes into the scan. His hand twitched again. This time both hands. His back began to arch incrementally, a motion so subtle that someone not trained to see it might miss it entirely. Elena could see it. She could see the tension climbing his body like a wave, building, pressing toward a breaking point. She reached for the door handle. The sound of her movement, barely a whisper, pulled Ashford's attention. He turned. Their eyes met. His expression shifted from irritation to anger in the space of a single heartbeat. He set down his tablet and moved toward her with the momentum of a man about to give orders he expected to be obeyed. Elena's hand left the door handle. She held his gaze with the kind of stillness that comes from having already made her choice, already accepted the consequences. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply looked at him the way you'd look at someone standing between you and the only exit in a burning building, with the calm recognition that one of you would have to move. The boy's oxygen saturation dropped. 97%. Then 96. Ashford opened his mouth to say something, but the intercom crackled before sound came out. The MRI tech's voice was suddenly pitched higher, suddenly urgent. We're getting movement. Significant motor activity. His respiratory patterns changing. On the monitors, Elena watched the boy's heart rate climb. 88 to 94 to 102. His chest was heaving now, visible even through the sedation. His mouth opened. His back arched more dramatically. The seizure was accelerating toward emergence, building toward the moment when his body would convulse against the machinery that was supposed to image his brain and instead might trap him in the confined space of the scanner during a full neurological crisis. Abort the sequence, Ashford commanded, moving to the console. Get him out of the tunnel. Now. But that was when the boy's body went rigid. His entire frame locked, muscles contracting against themselves with the kind of force that typically preceded loss of consciousness. His hands clenched into fists. His back arched so violently that Elena could see daylight between his shoulders and the scanning table. The boy's mouth opened. His airway, the part of him that hadn't spoken in 6 months, began to spasm. The technical term was laryngospasm. What it meant in practical terms was that his vocal cords were seizing, closing off the passage of air the way a door slams shut. His oxygen saturation dropped. 95, 93. 91, the number falling like a stone through water. The tech was calling for help. Ashford was moving. One of the residents was running for the crash cart. But they were moving through a world of bureaucracy and training protocols, moving with the precision of people following flowcharts while a child suffocated in a magnetic tunnel. Elena was already moving. She pushed past Ashford without looking at him, moved to the control console, and made direct eye contact with the MRI tech. I need him out. Now. I'm going in. You can't go into the magnetic field, we can't have metal. The MRI is off. Abort it. Do it. The tech's hands moved on instinct, killing the sequence. The humming ceased. The absence of sound was louder than the noise had been. Elena was moving before the magnetic field fully died, before it was truly safe, but she was moving anyway. She pulled off her watch. She had no phone, no badge clip, nothing metal. Just her scrubs and her hands and the muscle memory that had never left her, 7 years of civilian life and 2 years of therapy and careful distance from her former self notwithstanding. The boy was still locked in rigid contraction, his face turning blue at the edges, his mouth open in silent suffocation. Elena reached him, positioned her hands on either side of his jaw, and made a decision that violated protocol in approximately 17 different ways. She didn't call for anesthesia. She didn't wait for Ashford or the residents. She positioned her fingers along his mandible, found the angle she needed, and executed a move called a jaw thrust, a technique from a battlefield in Helm and Province where there was no anesthesia, no time, no margin for debate. The boy's airway opened. Immediately. The spasm released. His body, still rigid, still seizing, could now draw air. The color began returning to his face. His oxygen saturation climbed off the cliff. 88, 92, 95. Get me a pediatric airway kit, Elena said, her voice level as ice water, her hands moving with the kind of certainty that only existed in people who'd done this before when the alternative was death. 12-gauge angiocath. Prep for emergent cricothyrotomy if the spasm doesn't break in the next 30 seconds. Nobody moved. Now, she said. The word wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. The residents moved. Ashford moved. The world reorganized itself around her voice like iron filings rearranging around a magnet. The boy's seizure continued, his body still locked, still burning through whatever neurological fire was consuming him, but his airway was open. His oxygen was flowing. The immediate threat of suffocation had shifted into the realm of manageable emergency, the kind that didn't require a miraculous save because it required something rarer, the right hands at the right moment. Elena kept her hands in place, her posture perfect, her breathing slow and deliberate. She could feel Ashford staring at her. She could feel the moment when he understood that whatever he'd done in the last 24 hours, whatever barriers he'd erected, none of it mattered. The boy lived because of her. And everyone in that room knew it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd just violated direct orders. She'd overstepped. She'd performed a medical intervention without authorization. She'd done exactly what Ashford had written her up for, exactly what he'd barred her from doing, and she'd done it in front of witnesses with her name on the hospital record as the nurse who did it. In 3 hours, there would be a formal disciplinary meeting. In 5 hours, she'd be escorted out by security. She understood that now, standing in radiology suite with her hands on a child's face and the blue of his lips turning back to pink. She'd saved him. And she'd destroyed herself in the process. The thought didn't move her. Her hands remained steady. The MRI machine hummed its mechanical rhythm, a sound Elena had learned to hate, the grinding percussion of a device designed to peer into the darkest parts of the human body and expose what nobody wanted revealed. Jacob Hartley lay motionless on the scanner table, his small frame lost inside the tunnel of white plastic and electromagnetic coils. Commander Hartley stood behind the lead glass, one hand pressed flat against the window as if he could will his son toward safety through sheer force of rank and love. Elena watched from the doorway, still in her regular scrubs, no longer invited into the radiology suite by official order but present anyway, a shadow the system had forgotten to remove. Dr. Ashford stood at the control panel, supremely confident, certain that his expensive machinery and superior credentials would finally unlock what nobody else could solve. He had no idea what was about to happen. The residents flanking him shifted their weight, checking their phones, bored. The machine clicked. Word. The baseline electrical hum deepened. And then Jacob's body went rigid. Not the rigid of a bad connection, not the rigid of muscle tension from fear. Rigid like someone had replaced his skeleton with iron rods, like every nerve ending in his small body had fired at once. His eyes rolled back. His fingers curled into white-knuckled fists. A guttural sound emerged from his throat, not words, not language, but pure animal distress, the sound of a child's nervous system screaming without words because words had been stolen from him 6 months ago. Commander Hartley's hand slammed against the glass hard enough to crack it. The residents froze. Dr. Ashford's face shifted from confidence to confusion in the span of a heartbeat. He jabbed at the controls. Shut it down, he ordered, but his voice had lost its authority, had become the voice of a man suddenly aware that his medical degree might not be enough. The machine powered down with a metallic shriek. The resident scrambled. Someone called a code. But the code was wrong, they were calling it as an epileptic seizure, as a neurological event that could be treated with the standard protocol of sedation and restraint, and Elena knew with the certainty of someone who had held dying soldiers in her hands and learned to read their bodies like maps, that Jacob Hartley was seizing from terror, not from damaged circuitry. The seizure was psychogenic. It was his nervous system, still locked in the night of the accident, still convinced he was in danger. The machinery was making it worse. Elena moved before thought completed itself. The muscles in her legs obeyed commands that came from somewhere deeper than conscious decision, from Sanjin, from the field hospital where she had learned that hesitation killed people, that the moment between inaction and action was the difference between breathing and flatline. She pushed past the nearest resident, her shoulder connecting with his torso with the casual force of someone who had learned to move through crowded spaces without asking permission. Martinez, step back now, Ashford's voice cracked like he was shouting at someone drowning who had disobeyed his order to stay calm. She didn't hear him. She was already dropping to her knees beside the table, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of an apex predator settling into its element. Jacob was still seizing, his small body convulsing against the padding. His airway was compromised. His tongue had rolled back. 30 seconds of this and his oxygen saturation would crater. 60 seconds and his brain would start dying. She tilted his head back with her right hand, opening his airway with a jaw thrust she had performed 1,000 times on soldiers whose names she tried not to remember. Her left hand found the spot on his chest just below his sternum, the place where a heart was hammering like it wanted to escape the cage of ribs. She pressed her palm flat there, not hard enough to hurt, hard enough to anchor him to reality. "You're safe," she said, her voice dropping into the register she used to use in the field hospital, the voice that had talked wounded men back from the edge of shock. "The noise can't hurt you. You're safe." The words weren't hers. They belonged to a sergeant she had treated in Helmand province, a man who had been blown out of his Humvee and convinced for 3 hours that the medevac helicopter was enemy fire. She had sat with him while he bled, whispering those same words, and he had survived. "You're safe," she said again. "You're safe." Jacob's rigid body began, almost imperceptibly, to soften. The convulsions that had been violent and all-consuming started to space themselves out, 1 second between them, then 2. His oxygen saturation on the monitor climbed, 78, 81, 84. Still not enough. She kept her hand on his chest. "Listen to my voice. You're in a hospital. The machines can't hurt you. You're safe." 30 seconds passed. The seizures were becoming smaller, less violent, transforming from grand mal devastation into the smaller aftershocks of a nervous system beginning to understand that the threat had passed. Ashford was still standing paralyzed at the control panel, his mouth moving silently like a fish landed on a dock, like his brain had not yet received instructions from his higher functions. The residents had stopped moving. They were staring at Elena with an expression she would never quite see the name for, but which translated into, "We just watched a person become someone else." Elena reached into the pocket of her scrubs with her free hand. The vial of midazolam was there because she had stolen it 3 days ago, prepared for exactly this scenario, broken protocol so comprehensively that there was no coming back from it. She had learned the exact dose in Sanjin, the precise milligrams of benzodiazepine needed to stop a neurotrauma seizure without collapsing the respiratory system of a small child. 2 milligrams. She had calculated it for a 30-pound boy the moment she saw Jacob's chart. The needle went in smooth, almost unnoticed, and the medication began to flow. Within 90 seconds, she would know the exact count later. When she replayed it in the rain, the seizures stopped entirely. Jacob's body went limp, not in the way of death but in the way of blessed unconsciousness, of a nervous system finally allowed to rest. His oxygen saturation climbed one more time, crossing the threshold into safety, 88, 92, 95, holding at normal. The heart monitor settled into a steady rhythm, sinus, beautiful and perfect. The only sound left in the room was the sound of a child breathing. Elena rose slowly, her back screaming, the old shrapnel wound that had never quite healed sending lightning through her vertebrae as she straightened. She stepped away from the table without looking at any of them. For one moment, just one, the residents stared at her like she had materialized from somewhere outside their understanding of what human beings were capable of. Then Ashford's voice cut through the silence, shaking with something that might have been fear or might have been rage or might have been the sound of a man watching his entire professional identity disintegrate in real time. "That was an unauthorized procedure," he said, and his voice was hollow, the voice of someone reading lines that had been written in his head 1,000 times but never expecting to have to actually say them. "You are suspended effective immediately pending full investigation." Commander Hartley had collapsed against the window, his forehead pressed to the glass, his shoulders heaving. He was looking at Elena, and his eyes held something that looked like recognition, the kind of recognition that came from one soldier seeing another soldier do what needed to be done. Ashford was already on his radio, his hand shaking as he called security. By end of shift, Elena's access credentials were deactivated. The badge that had opened every door for 3 years simply stopped working. Ashford called an emergency board meeting with his longtime allies, the same physicians he had lunch with, the same men whose careers were tied to his authority structure. Within hours, the decision was made: she was a safety risk, unsupervised medical procedures, scope of practice violations, liability exposure. It was over. He personally escorted her to her locker with security flanking both sides, 2 men in dark uniforms watching while she collected the few personal items she had allowed herself to bring to work. The dying succulent that had been on her locker shelf. A coffee mug with a cracked handle that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded white letters. These went into a cardboard box that had once held for kits. At the bottom of her locker, she found the photograph. She had taken it down from her apartment 6 months ago and hidden it here instead, too painful to look at every morning but too necessary to throw away. 12 faces. 3 rows of soldiers in digital camouflage and body armor, standing in front of Bagram Airfield, 2011. Every single one of them smiling because they didn't know yet. 7 of those faces belonged to the dead. Elena walked out into the rain without an umbrella. It was Houston rain, warm and heavy and unforgiving, the kind that soaked through fabric in minutes and made it impossible to tell if you were crying or drowning. Her scrub stuck to her skin. The cardboard box started to soften in her hands. Nobody offered her a ride. Nobody stopped to say goodbye. The nurses who had stood with her in the break room had been reassigned to different floors by morning, orders from Ashford, communication sent through administrative channels, a reorganization that looked random but was absolutely precise. Divide and conquer. Eliminate the witnesses. She stood at the bus stop 3 blocks away, rain hammering down like it was trying to drive her into the asphalt, and held the box against her chest. The patch was still inside her jacket lining where she had sewn it years ago, a faded piece of fabric with unit insignia that meant nothing to anyone who saw it and everything to her. She had worn that patch into Sanjin. She had worn it when the field hospital took incoming fire. She had worn it through the moment the shrapnel tore through her back and the moment she realized 7 of her friends would never go home. She had brought it to Houston because leaving it behind felt like abandonment. Now, standing in the rain, watching a bus full of other people's normal lives drive past, she wondered if she had run from her past only to sacrifice a child's future to it. 2 days after Elena stood at that rain-soaked bus stop holding a cardboard box with a cracked coffee mug and a dying succulent, Commander Hartley walked into Oak Creek Memorial's administrative offices and filed a formal complaint demanding her reinstatement. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and he had documentation, 3 independent medical consultants confirming that the procedure Elena performed in the radiology suite matched advanced field protocols, that her intervention had unquestionably saved his son's life, that Dr. Gerald Ashford's diagnosis had been incomplete at best and dangerously negligent at worst. The hospital's legal team felt the ground shift beneath them. A routine expanded background check was initiated. It was procedural, automatic, the kind of administrative task that usually revealed nothing more than a parking ticket or an old speeding fine. But Elena's file contained something else entirely. Buried in the system, flagged red and classified, was a security clearance still active in her name. Major Elena Martinez. Army Nurse Corps. 3 combat deployments. The clearance had been updated just 18 months prior. Someone, somewhere, had maintained her credentials as if waiting for her to come home. The hospital attorney's hands trembled as she opened the file in preparation for the disciplinary hearing. She had never seen a personnel file like this. Medical licenses were one thing. This was something else, a document that changed the entire context of everything that had happened. When the hearing convened 3 days later, Commander Hartley sat across from Dr. Ashford with the composure of a man who had already won. He looked directly at the hospital board and said 5 words that made the room go silent: "You fired Major Martinez." Dr. Ashford's face went pale. The blood drained from his jaw. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The hospital attorney, feeling the shift in power like a sudden drop in cabin pressure, opened Elena's service file with trembling hands. Her voice broke as she read aloud. Major Elena Martinez, Army Nurse Corps. 3 combat deployments. 18 years of active service. Medically discharged following catastrophic injuries sustained during a field hospital bombing in Kandahar province. She turned the page. The photos were the first thing: Elena in desert fatigues, her unit standing in front of a prefabricated hospital tent, 12 faces arranged in 2 rows. The attorney's eyes watered. She kept reading. The formal military documentation continued, each line carrying more weight than the last. Ashford's breathing became audible, short, shallow. He gripped the edge of the table. Then the hospital's phone system buzzed. A call was being patched through to the hearing room. Commander Hartley had arranged it. The speaker crackled, and a voice filled the conference room, a voice that carried the unmistakable timbre of someone accustomed to absolute authority. It was a Navy SEAL commander who had been treated at Oak Creek Memorial 8 months prior, who had heard through the grapevine what had happened to Elena, and who had made one phone call to ensure this hearing took place with full documentation. His voice was steady, clipped, the kind of voice that delivered orders without explanation. He spoke directly to the hospital board. Major Martinez saved my life in Sanjin Valley. She was operating a field surgical station under direct mortar fire. Multiple casualties, ammunition shortage, no evacuation available for 18 hours. She performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife and a stethoscope while rounds impacted the tent fabric. She ran into active fire to retrieve a wounded soldier and carried him back under her own body armor. The board members were frozen. One of them was taking notes, but her pen had stopped moving. The SEAL commander continued, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, controlled, powerful, impossible to interrupt. Bronze Star with Valor. Pause. Reaction rippled. Purple Heart. Ashford's face had gone the color of old paper. Combat Medical Badge. Another beat. Meritorious Service Medal. The commander's next words landed like a rifle shot. She ran into fire to pull out 6 wounded while the aid station was under direct mortar attack. She held a soldier's organs inside his body cavity while waiting for transport. She made medical decisions under conditions that would paralyze most physicians. And she did it because that's what Major Martinez does. That's who she is. The line went silent. The speaker hummed with static. Ashford tried to speak and produced only a hoarse, incoherent sound. That evening, desperate to control the narrative and salvage his reputation, Dr. Gerald Ashford agreed to a live interview with a local news station. He sat under bright studio lights, his tie already loosened, sweat forming at his temples. His jaw worked as the anchor introduced the segment, "The Nurse He Fired." Ashford spoke with the defensive precision of a man accustomed to never being questioned. Nurses cannot simply override physicians, regardless of their backgrounds. This was about maintaining medical hierarchy and patient safety protocols. The individual in question performed unsupervised medical procedures that violated every standard of hospital practice. His voice was steady, practiced. He had said these words to himself 1,000 times. I had to maintain order. Had to establish boundaries. This was not personal. This was about institutional integrity. The anchor nodded politely, and Ashford felt the ground stabilizing beneath him. He was winning. He could feel it. Then the anchor's earpiece lit up. Her expression shifted. She looked confused. "Dr. Ashford, we're receiving a call. I'm told we need to take live." Ashford's confidence flickered. "It's actually quite unusual for us to interrupt during a live segment, but our producer is indicating this is important." She patched the call through. The connection crackled. A woman's voice emerged from the speaker, official and measured and carrying the weight of the entire United States Navy behind it. "This is the office of the Secretary of the Navy. We're calling regarding your comments about Major Elena Martinez, a decorated combat veteran who holds the Bronze Star with Valor, a Purple Heart, and a combat medical badge." The studio went silent. Ashford's face drained of color so rapidly it was visible on camera. The spokesperson continued, her voice steady and immovable as granite. "Major Martinez performed a standard field medical protocol that has saved hundreds of lives in combat zones. Your decision to terminate her employment after she saved a child's life is currently under investigation by the Navy's Office of Community Outreach and the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General." Ashford opened his mouth. Nothing emerged. The camera remained fixed on his face, the sweat on his temples, the tremor in his jaw, the slow and complete collapse of his carefully constructed authority. "We are recommending that you retain legal counsel, Dr. Ashford. This interview is being documented." The line went dead. For million viewers watched him stammer. For million people watched a man's entire professional existence unravel in real time, watched his confidence crumble into incoherent deflection, watched the moment his career became a cautionary tale. The anchor, with the professional composure of someone who understood that silence was more devastating than any question, simply said, "We'll be right back." And the screen cut to commercial. By midnight, the video had gone viral. By morning, the hospital board had reconvened in emergency session. Commander Hartley's son was awake, coherent, speaking his first words in 6 months, and those words were simple and devastating to everything Ashford had claimed. "Where's the nurse?" The boy had spoken her name. Not Dr. Ashford. Not the physician who had ordered tests that traumatized him. Not the authority figure who had dismissed his suffering. He asked for Elena. The hospital board voted unanimously within 3 hours. Dr. Gerald Ashford was terminated for cause. His medical credentials were placed under review. His reputation, carefully constructed over 23 years, collapsed like a structure built on sand. 3 other nurses came forward with formal complaints about his conduct, complaints they had been too afraid to file when he possessed institutional power. A leaked internal investigation revealed a pattern of silencing dissent, of weaponizing protocol against anyone who questioned his authority, of isolation tactics used against staff members who posed perceived threats to his position. The board issued Elena a formal written apology and a settlement offer that included full reinstatement with back pay, comprehensive health coverage, and a position in hospital administration should she want it. News trucks camped outside Oak Creek Memorial for 6 consecutive days. Local television ran segments about military nurses, about the sacrifices that veterans made in silence, about the quiet heroism of people who came home and tried to build something normal and found instead that the world had forgotten what they were made of. 6 months later, Elena Martinez walked through Oak Creek Memorial wearing a badge that read Director of Emergency Medicine, and she walked with purpose, her limp still present but her head high, her eyes meeting the gaze of everyone she passed. The nurses who had once stood and left when she sat down at the break room table now greeted her with genuine respect. Some had worked with her for 3 years without knowing. Some had watched her stand accused and had stayed silent. Now they called her Dr. Martinez. Now they listened when she spoke. Commander Hartley brought his son in for a follow-up appointment, and the boy ran ahead of his parents and threw his arms around Elena in the hallway, talking excitedly about starting 2nd grade, about his new teacher, about the things he wanted to tell people now that the silence had finally broken. Elena held him with hands that had held so much grief, and she listened to his voice, and she let herself believe that some things broken enough to seem impossible could be restored. In her new office, on the wall beside her medical licenses and formal commendations, Elena kept a frame containing a faded unit patch, the one she had carried sewn inside her field jacket lining, the patch that had survived the bombing, that had traveled with her to Houston, that had been held in a cardboard box at a rain-soaked bus stop. She touched it each morning before her shift began, remembering the 12 faces in the unit photo, honoring the 7 who didn't come home, carrying forward the weight that no one else could see. It was her private ritual, her daily acknowledgement that some wars never truly ended, that some soldiers came home in nurses' uniforms, that heroism often looked like showing up and being kind to people on the worst days of their lives. Across the city, in a strip mall parking lot where the afternoon heat shimmered like gasoline fumes rising from cracked asphalt, Dr. Gerald Ashford sat at a folding table selling supplemental insurance policies to people who avoided his eye contact. His medical career was over. His name appeared in hospital ethics seminars as a case study in institutional corruption. Former colleagues crossed the street when they saw him approaching. He had built his entire identity on the exercise of authority, and now he was invisible, and the invisibility was its own form of destruction. Elena never thought about him at all. That was the thing about true strength, it didn't require vindication. It didn't need an audience. It simply moved forward. 3 weeks after her promotion was made official, Elena stood in front of a room full of military nurses at a regional veterans medical conference, and she spoke about trauma and about silence and about the particular kind of courage it took to come home. Her voice was steady, authoritative, carrying the weight of experience that could not be faked or purchased or learned from any textbook. "I tried to leave the war behind," she said, and the room went absolutely silent. "I thought healing meant forgetting. But some battles choose you, and the skills we earned in fire don't expire when we come home. They don't become less relevant. They become everything." The room erupted in standing ovation. Hands came together like applause after an explosion. She stood at the podium, and she let herself accept that recognition, not for vanity, but because these people understood. These people had been where she had been. These people knew. That evening, Elena returned to her apartment and stood at her kitchen window watching the sun set over Houston, casting everything in shades of amber and rust. She thought about the child's voice asking where the nurse was. She thought about the phone call from the secretary of the Navy's office. She thought about the moment at the bus stop when she believed that running from her past had cost a child his future. She was wrong. She had never been running from her past. She had been running toward something. She had been searching for a place where her skills meant something again, where the lessons of Sanjin could save lives in a different kind of theater. In her office the next morning, Elena's hand moved to the framed unit patch as it always did. The morning light caught the fabric and made it glow like stained glass. Beside it sat a new mug on her desk, plain white ceramic, with 2 lines of text in simple block letters, Director of Emergency Medicine. Below her medical licenses hung her formal portrait, Major Elena Martinez in dress uniform, the kind of photo that used to exist only in files and clearances and classified archives. Now it hung where anyone could see it. The nurse who had stood alone at a rain-soaked bus stop had returned home. Not to Houston. Not to civilian life. But to herself. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.